For decades, science has been plagued by a singular question. Could we ever teach a chimpanzee how to talk, how to speak a language like a human? For a long time, the answer to that question was no. But thanks to the results of a new paper, the new answer is, I don't know, maybe. Hello and welcome, my gentle and of course very modern apes. My name is Erica, this is Gutsick, my YouTube channel, and here we talk about human evolution and primatology, and I debunk a lot of pseudoscience. And today's topic is one that is very near and dear to my heart because it's just so interesting. I know I say that about a lot of topics, but what can I say? I'm sick with the boundless curiosity of the human spirit.
Another day! Another sleigh!
Although I really probably should be saying the boundless curiosity of the hominid spirit, because today's topic is raising some really important questions with regard to what it is that separates humans, our species, from the rest of the apes. Yet again, of course, we find ourselves staring down the shrinking gap of human exceptionalism.
Sin City wasn't made for you.
A lot of you right now are rushing down to the comment section to let me know that a chimpanzee is never going to be having this kind of conversation using this kind of technology. And to that I say, I already made a video covering that, and also a new paper just came out that really underpins some of the stuff I said in that video. So go check that out. Links maybe in the description. But I will say, and I maintain this is still a difference in degree, that the way that I'm conveying information to you right now, by popping my lips and clacking my tongue around against my teeth and carefully managing airflow as it passes through my vocal folds, which are seated in my larynx that sits deep within my throat, to utter a set of sounds that have meaning to you that is based off of a mutually agreed upon set of meanings, that's pretty weird, isn't it? Language, or the set of sounds and their associated mutually agreed upon meanings, and speech, which is the production of said sounds to communicate wants and needs, appear to be unique to Homo sapiens, at least among modern hominids. And that's bizarre. We are the only great apes that yap, and I don't think it's controversial to say that this has been pretty critical for our success as a species. Because we're the only apes with the gift of gab, and because we are so ubiquitous on the surface of this planet, we've been trying to figure out for a very, very long time how and why language and speech evolved. And given the utility of language and speech, why are we the only ones left that do it? This is a really big topic, and I don't think that this is going to be the video where I do the entire thing justice. I'm mostly making this video to briefly summarize the story so far and then talk about the result of a new paper. However, that doesn't mean we can go into this with absolutely zero background. So let's talk a little bit about the history of teaching other great apes how to talk. So science is a lot less insane than it used to be, and what I mean by that is that in the 19th and 20th century, experiments were just kind of like, what if I did a thing? What if we took the head of one dog and tried to sew it onto another dog? What if we gave elephants LSD? What if we tried to remote control a bunch of animals? What would happen if we did that? What would happen if we took a baby monkey and put it in solitary confinement for a year and then called that solitary confinement the pit of despair? What would happen if we did that?
Stop it. Get some help.
In some of these super weird experiments, we learned important things, and in others, we just tortured a lot of animals. So it was a very different period for scientific inquiry, I think. And it should come as no surprise that this is also the time period in which we first started investigating why language evolved, how language evolved. And I kind of love this because the first approaches to language evolution, the first questions that we kind of asked, where we looked around at the other apes and we noticed that they didn't talk. And we said to ourselves, well, maybe it's just because no one's taught them. Some of the most famous and noteworthy of these investigations were many of the experiments where researchers would just kind of take a baby chimpanzee, which were a lot easier to get at the time apparently, and raise them as if they were human, right? From baby to at least puberty. Sometimes this occurred alongside a human child, and sometimes they just raised the chimpanzee as if it was a human child, and sometimes they just met its needs to see what would happen. And I probably don't need to tell you this, but despite the well-meaning motivation behind many of these researchers, I'm sure, the results of these experiments were disastrous to the well-being of basically every non-human ape involved. One thing to keep in mind as we look at some of these experiments is that the big question was this: why don't other great apes speak? Is it because they actually can and they're just choosing not to? They can't because of a neurological reason, or they can't because of some kind of equipment issue with the larynx or the jaws or the tongue, etc. So first up is the Hayeses in the 1940s and 1950s. They raised a little female chimp named Vicky as they would a human infant and attempted to teach her how to speak.
Research psychologist Dr. Keith Hayes and his wife raised a chimp named Vicky. After constant training, Vicky had learned to speak only 3 human words by the time she was 3 years old.
Now, they felt that the issue was more of an equipment-based one, a mechanical problem, that Vicky couldn't physically form the words. That was what was limiting chimpanzees with speech, that it wasn't a neurological thing, that she couldn't physically form them. And so to help her, they physically manipulated Vicky's mouth and jaws and lips to help her form certain words. And after months of intensive training, Vicky was able to say 4 words: mama, papa, cup, and up. And I feel like those last 2 are kind of cheating.
Mrs. Hayes would shape Vicky's lips to help her pronounce the word mama. At the age of 2 1/2, she could say papa and cup.
Furthermore, remember, the Hayeses were helping her make those sounds with their hands, so really none of them count. At the end, it wasn't like Vicky could say any human word vocally on her own.
Now who am I? Papa? Papa?
And this study is in part responsible for why, when you Google "why can't chimpanzees speak" or non-human apes speak, you see, well, they don't have the equipment. They can't form the words physically with their lips and palate and vocal cords as an explanation. It's a mechanical issue. However, Vicky was pretty intelligent as far as a non-human ape went, and this was noted by the Hayeses, who remarked that when Vicky wanted something, she would usually ape or mime what it was that she wanted or what it was that she wanted done. Because of this and several other experiments that were going on at the time, people came to the conclusion that maybe speech and language just isn't how these guys communicate, and that we might have better luck with sign language. We saw just that in 1966 with Washoe, another baby female chimpanzee. The gardeners were intent on teaching Washoe sign language and bringing her up, raising her as one might raise a child who was deaf. And so they made sure that all the researchers who worked around Washoe communicated with and around her using only sign language.
Come. Open. Open, hurry. Open. Open, hurry. Open, hurry. Open. Open. Open.
Washoe is really interesting for a lot of reasons, and not just because of her ability to use ASL, and I should have specified earlier, she was taught American Sign Language. Washoe could use 350 signs that were confirmed by, external observers and not just her immediate team, which is quite a lot.
Where is the play baby? Where?
As she grew up, Washoe's vocabulary gently expanded. For the first time, an ape was shown to use a human language.
Smart, Washoe.
Good, 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 me. Yes, you're very good. Good, go. Good, go. Where? You? Peekaboo. Out. Me. Oh, play hide. Peekaboo. Okay. Come, good Washoe. Come with me.
And she actually ended up teaching her son how to use American Sign Language.
Initially, we didn't see any tutoring, but the first 8 days, he was with her when we went back and looked at the analysis of the behavior. She would do things such as this. She would look at him, sign come, and then approach him and retrieve him. And that went on for 5 days. Then what she would do for starting on day 6 is she'd look at him, orient toward him, and sign come, but she would no longer approach. So what we think is that the vast majority of the signs he acquired, he picked them up. And we have evidence also for that by the way signs came in.
It's also worth noting that Washoe babbled when she was trying to learn sign language, when she was first picking it up. That's something that human babies do when they're learning how to speak. They make a bunch of different sounds and are trying to figure out which ones elicit which responses. And actually, human children who are deaf babble with their hands. They do the same exact thing, despite the fact that they can't speak or that they can't hear, and so they're using sign language to get their point across. So Washoe is doing something directly analogous to what we see in human babies. That, in addition to several studies that Washoe was the or a subject in, were objective. Everybody agrees that that is the case. But there's a lot of stuff surrounding Washoe that is controversial. For instance, she was claimed by her team to be able to combine words to sort of refer to a complex subject that she didn't have a single word for. So for instance, she was signing to another chimpanzee and trying to refer to a thermos, and the way that she signed to the other chimpanzee was metal cup drink. That's really cool regardless, but Washoe's research team argued that this was an example of inventive language, while other researchers not a part of the team instead put forward the idea that Washoe was basically just describing the thermos, and so this wasn't akin to something that you might see in humans. Washoe's team alleges that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of novel combinations that were utilized by Washoe and some of the other chimpanzees in their care, and detractors kind of say, no, that's not really what you think it is, because when you see sign language, you as the human observer have to do some interpreting. And detractors, including the likes of Nim Chimpsky, and we're going to see this more when we talk about Koko, argued that our brains are kind of filling in the blanks there. We might be the ones who are imposing that on their signs, which are sometimes difficult to discern because other apes have really big hands and really fat fingers. But regardless of where you stand all that, Washoe was pretty impactful to the community with regard to primate language studies, ape language studies specifically. In fact, not just the language stuff, she also had a pretty big impact on how we perceive personhood in non-human animals, because she is argued to have demonstrated quite a bit of support for theory of mind in non-human apes, which wasn't super well supported at the time just because research hadn't been done on the subject. I think it's fair to say that Washoe is generally considered a success for great ape language studies and support for teaching these guys language, specifically ASL. The same cannot be said for Nim Chimpsky. Nim Chimpsky is of course a play on Noam Chomsky, and Nim was explicitly meant to be a response to the critics of Washoe and her associated experiments. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because the experiments, the methodology, and the documentation surrounding Nim Chimpsky was just absolute garbage compared to the logging that was done with Washoe. Nim only learned 125 signs, and he was also not taught sign language as a baby growing up. It was only introduced to him later on in life, well past some pretty critical development periods that Washoe had the advantage of being taught during, and that are pretty important for human development as well. Nim is probably most famous for holding the record of longest sentence signed by a chimpanzee, and it's the me eat orange sentence.
Nim's longest recorded sentence was, give orange, me give eat orange, me eat orange, give me eat orange, give me you.
People love to cite that and go, haha, see, chimps are just dumb, they can't actually speak, that's their longest sentence? Well, I can say longer sentences than that. Human exceptionalism for the win. And to that I say, Nim Chimpsky is a really poor reason to talk trash about the great ape language studies. I mean, he's not a poor reason to talk trash about them. It was not a good study, and it was pretty irresponsible, and the study design was horrible, and we didn't learn very much. But like, we did and have learned quite a bit from other aspects of the grade 8 language studies, even if some of them were also ethically dubious. I don't know, it just seems really weird to me that the people who found Washoe's story interesting and compelling were like, let's do a worse version of that experiment. And then they did do that, and then people point to the worst version of the Washoe experiment and are like, see? They can't even sign very well. It just kind of rubs me the wrong way. There are many reasons to criticize grade 8 language studies, and we're going to talk about the improvements that have been made on that field here in a moment after we talk about Koko. But Nim Chimpsky is not the defeater of this, I don't think. Especially when it's phrased like they tried to replicate the Washoe experiment and failed in Nim Chimpsky. Like, they didn't really do a good job replicating it, and I know a little something about initially trying and failing to replicate a study. So next came Penny Patterson, who was actually a student of the Gardners in the 1970s, with Koko the gorilla. And I know you know about Koko. I know we've all seen this video, and we're very depressed afterwards. Koko was a lowland gorilla who was also taught American Sign Language, although Penny preferred to call it GSL, or Gorilla Sign Language, which I think is a little bit problematic for what happens next. The studies with Koko and the observations, really, of Koko were plagued by many of the same problems that a lot of the Washoe observations and studies were plagued with, which is it's kind of hard to interpret sign language objectively when you've got a human observer and a non-human ape as a subject.
She's got a good sense of humor.
Oh no! A monster! A monster coming to get the alligator!
She can be very stubborn, very willful.
Finish! You are not finished! You are not! You are not finished! You didn't do the work I asked. Please pick those up. Koko, you are very good at that. Please pick them up.
Patterson proposes that Koko knew 1,000 signs and over 2,000 English words, like she could understand over 2,000 English words, and she's received a whole lot of criticism because of the previous reasons that I just stated, and then also because of the ethics surrounding Koko's care. Koko was very large for a female gorilla. She was like 270 pounds, and female gorillas are like usually not getting past 200, to the point that when you see her, it almost looks like she's got like a sagittal crest. She's quite large, a big gorilla.
Who is that? Think me there. Okay, that is you. Gorilla. Animal. Koko love. Okay, that's very good. That is you.
Then there's like the nipple lawsuit and controversy, which has its own section on the Wikipedia article surrounding Koko. Again, I'm going to cover all of this in a much more in-depth video at some point. But really, I think we can sum up the Koko situation and the Koko studies with they just weren't objective enough. I think it can be fairly well argued that Kanzi didn't have that problem. Kanzi, unlike our previous subjects, is a bonobo, the first bonobo that we're discussing, bonobos being close relatives of chimpanzees. And Kanzi wasn't taught to speak or communicate via sign language or active speech. Instead, Kanzi communicates using a lexigram, or a big board with a bunch of symbols on it that you can punch, and the symbols correspond to specific words. They don't look like they're words, they truly are symbolic, meaning there is no room for subjective interpretation here. When Kanzi presses a button, that is the button that he means. You don't accidentally impose your own understanding onto it. Kanzi's studies were overseen by Sue Rumbaugh, and later she's known as Sue Savage Rumbaugh.
Up a picture, just one. Try picking up just one. Tell Sue what it is.
Orange
That's
juice.
real good. Okay, now do the next one. Just the top one. Whoops, you got two.
Celery.
Yeah. Now, that's real good. Now just the top one. Just one picture.
Sweet potato.
Now do that one.
Peanut.
Kanzi was put into these lexigram studies kind of by happenstance. Originally, the researchers were trying to teach his adopted mother, who was a bonobo, how to utilize the lexigram, but she wasn't very good at it, and it wasn't until they noticed that Kanzi was like independently demonstrating an understanding of the lexigram without being taught directly by humans that they were like, okay, this is the new test subject. Kanzi is the one who we're going to run these studies on. Since then, Kanzi has learned over 350 lexigram symbols, and he understands over 3,000 human words. And we know that to be the case this time because the experiments were undertaken objectively within the context of a lab.
Open the refrigerator and get the oil. You see some oil in there? Good job. Thank you. Now, could you get the celery out? Get the celery out that's in the refrigerator also. Thank you very much. Okay. Smash the bug with the rock. Good job. Good job. Thank you. Put your collar in the potty. Thank you. Very nice.
And so there is a rich body of literature about this guy and his language capabilities that I think more or less reflect what we learned with Washoe. Now, that being said, there are anecdotes that surround Kanzi that are less well supported, generally proposed by the people who work with him every day, but I think we're at least at the point where we can say, yeah, you can teach great apes language to some degree. However, it's also accepted through the work with Kanzi that there are limitations on what we can teach other great apes with regard to language. Kanzi doesn't have a super firm grasp on syntax, and there are limitations to his ability to combine words. He also doesn't display recursion. So I guess Nim Chimpsky gets to keep his longest sentence record for now. One of the most important takeaways from these great ape language studies, specifically kind of capping things off with Kanzi, is that if we want to evaluate non-human great apes on their ability to produce speech and understand language, we can't do it on our terms. We can't try to force them to speak English, and we can't try to force them to use sign language. We need a way to assess them that is objective, like a lexigram, or we need to evaluate them on their own terms. And since then, we have done just that. Outside of Kanzi in the 80s and 90s, and work with him still does continue to this day, but we've turned to not just apes, but other primates and evaluated them in their natural communities and in highly controlled lab settings that can give us an objective look into how they communicate and how that bears on human speech and human language. How exactly does our means of communication differ from theirs? Where does vocalization become speech? In 2009, Watara and colleagues found that Campbell's monkeys, which they're a type of guinan, actually utilize syntax in their calls. The meaning of certain calls is modified by subsequent calls. Specifically, these monkeys have a call that might mean predator, and then they have an additional call that might mean from the air, meaning it's an eagle, or from below, meaning it's a leopard. Naturally, this suggests pretty deep origins for how we organize our vocalizations and move them from being mere vocalizations to being language and speech. In 2016, Gustafson and colleagues did a study on geladas, a type of cercopithecoid monkey that live on the Ethiopian highlands. They look kind of like baboons. And these guys are not like brilliant cercopithecoids. They're not known for being like super intelligent. But that being said, their communication style actually follows Zipf's and Menzerath's laws of linguistics. Put really simply, when geladas string vocalizations together in a sequence, it's structured in the same way that a human sentence is. In human sentence terms with regard to Menzerath's law, what this means is that the more syllables that are in the word, the smaller those syllables themselves are. And these guys are doing the same thing with their vocalizations, which suggests that Zipf's and Menzerath's law are very, very ancient indeed, that they existed before cercopithecoids and hominoids split off from their last shared common ancestor roughly 30 million years ago. And a lot of these language laws seem to apply to gestures as well, which makes sense since American Sign Language and all sign languages are types of languages. In 2019, Kurskin and colleagues found that chimpanzees' gestural repertoires, the vocabulary of gestures that they have, overlaps with the innate gestures that we see in 1 to 2-year-old humans by almost 90%. An example might be when I stick my hand out to you, you know that I'm asking you for something. Chimpanzees do that and human babies do that, and you don't have to teach them to do it either. This suggests also that there is a very deep root for common gestures amongst all apes, that this probably existed in our common ancestor, and that gestures might precede modern human language to some extent. And these gestures aren't just one-word demands either, because just a few weeks ago, Badihi and colleagues here in this year of our Lord 2024 found that chimpanzees have conversations using gestures at about the same speed that humans have vocal conversations, going back and forth and taking turns. These are just a handful of studies that I picked because they're some of the first ones that come to mind when I think of the evolution of language and the studies of how language evolved in humans versus how it compares to communication in other primates. And what I think all of these show, and again, they're just a few examples, is that we can find precursors to human language and speech all across the primate order. And I think a lot of these revelations have forced scientists to look back at some of these earlier great ape language studies, because remember, the original question on all of this was, why aren't other apes talking like we do? Is it because they're capable of doing it and they're just choosing to, or they've evolved to communicate in another way due to the natural process of evolution? Are they limited mechanically, or are they limited neurologically? And I think, if anything, a lot of these studies that I've just gone over have shown us that the basis is there in a lot of these non-human primates. And given their pretty long periods over the past several decades where we kind of wrote off other great apes and their ability to understand or produce language, either via gestures or vocally, I think that a lot of these recent discoveries have caused scientists to say, okay, well, maybe we should just kind of double check some of that work. Maybe we should go back and take another look-see. And that brings us here to this new paper from just a couple days ago, maybe a week or so ago, by Ekstrom and colleagues titled Chimpanzee Utterances Refute Purported Missing Links for Novel Vocalizations and Syllabic Speech. And basically what they've done is they've said, okay, speech production, can chimps do it? And where they started was by looking at old original footage from all the way back in those very first chimpanzee speech studies. The abstract starts us off by saying non-human great apes have been claimed to be unable to learn human words due to a lack of the necessary neural circuitry. And I'll go ahead and add here also mechanical differences, as we've seen. We've recovered original footage of 2 encultured chimpanzees uttering the word mama and subjected recordings to phonetic analysis. So encultured chimpanzees are just chimpanzees that have been taught certain words like in English or in some other human language. They're encultured to our culture. Our analyses demonstrate that chimpanzees are capable of syllabic production, achieving consonant to vowel phonetic contrasts via the simultaneous recruitment and coupling of voice, jaw, and lips. So the meaning of that sentence is they can produce words. In an online experiment, human listeners naive to the recording's origin reliably perceived chimpanzee utterances as syllabic utterances, primarily as mama among foil syllables. Our findings demonstrate that in the absence of direct data-driven examination, great ape vocal production capacities have been underestimated. Chimpanzees possess the neural building blocks necessary for speech. So this is really interesting, right? This is like a return to form, because a lot of these original great ape language studies were like, yeah, if you help them a lot, they can produce human words. And then very shortly after that, and for several decades, everyone was like, nope, they can't actually produce human words at all. And then now we're back to, well, they might be able to produce human words, at least some of them. Case in point, there's a quote here in the introduction in sort of recapitulating everything we've already talked about. It has long been claimed, however, that non-human primates are capable of vocal usage learning, producing pre-existing calls in new contexts, but not vocal production learning, modifying pre-existing signals, socially learning, or imitating calls from other individuals. This conclusion has not, however, been reached directly, but instead through second-hand accounts of classic ape language projects, which explicitly state that subjects did learn human words, such as cup and mama, and that some great ape species are more conversational than others, challenging the reputation of great apes as unsuitable models for speech and language evolution, chimpanzees in the wild do not produce any cup-like or mama-like utterances, suggesting that they are indeed vocal learners. In the absence of direct analyses of original recordings, the interpretation that, quote, despite repeated attempts, no non-human primates have ever been trained to produce speech sounds, not even chimpanzees raised for birth in human homes, has paradoxically become the prevailing belief. They go on to say that it has led to extrapolations that great apes lack key neural circuitry for voluntary motor control over voice and articulators, i.e. lip, tongue, jaws, as forwarded by the Kuipers-Jurgens hypothesis. Consequently, vocal production learning has been widely assumed to have emerged anew in the human lineage after it diverged from extant non-human great apes. So this is what we've all discussed so far. The next portion of the introduction makes a distinction between the types of sounds that humans make versus the types of sounds that we tend to see in like the great apes or even other catarrhine monkeys. So a lot of catarrhine monkeys and a lot of other great apes will like engage in lip smacking as a sort of communication between them. They basically go like that. And the authors here are making a distinction between the ability to make that kind of sound and the ability to make like ma 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 or ba 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 as a sound, where we're actually smacking our lips, but we're providing a voice to it as well. Specifically here, they're noting that the ability to make that ma 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 or ba 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 sound requires the cohesion of neural circuitry and motor skills to actually simultaneously smack our lips or utilize our tongue and apply a voice to it. That this has been proposed in the past to be one of the limiting factors for other great apes speaking. And then they go on to say, actually, no, it's not. And we know that because of a YouTube video that we found, and also by poring over footage of some of these oldest great ape language studies. And the craziest part is, they seem to be right.
There are two chimpanzees in Rome who have brought a new twist in communication between animal and human. No, we don't mean the dance, we mean Renata. She's a chimp with an IQ that has scientists climbing trees. With her trainer, Renata has developed a routine that draws applause from everyone. As explained by her foster mother, this is one of the most extraordinary chimps in the world. You don't have to know Italian to understand Renata's accent when she gets her cue.
Can you say mama? Mama? Mama. Is this for mama? Mama. You love your mama? Mama. You love mama? Mama. Here, sweetie.
How? Hold on, bro. How?
So in this next section titled, Who Are Johnny and Renata, or Who Were Johnny and Renata, because unfortunately both these chimps are dead. And Johnny is actually a chimpanzee that was featured in a home video posted to YouTube at the Suncoast Primate Sanctuary. So not like an official lab or a place where anybody's doing research, but someone basically recorded this chimpanzee that was there, a chimp named Johnny, saying mama, and then they uploaded it to YouTube where it was viewed 447,490 times. And this section talks about the comment section, how a bunch of people are basically saying, yeah, it does sound like he's saying mama. And then they talk about the other chimpanzee, Renata, who was featured in the film, now hear this, Italians Unveil Talking Chimp from 1962. And both of the recordings were downloaded from YouTube, and both of them have these chimps saying mama. And their support for this is basically like, it sounds like they're saying mama, and they were taught to say mama, so they've done vocal learning through imitation, which is basically how human babies learn how to speak, meaning that that's the basis of that kind of learning in humans existed before we split from chimpanzee, if they also have that type of learning almost hardwired into their brains. Now, the way that they actually ran this experiment was by testing a bunch of humans with regard to their perception. They say that the chimpanzee utterances, so n equals 2, one from Johnny and one from Renata, were mixed in with Spanish language Parkinson's speech utterances. Participants were instructed that utterances were from human speakers diagnosed with speech pathologies. Parkinsonian speech is characterized by delayed and imprecise articulation and dysphonic phonation compared to healthy controls. The purpose of the presentation scheme was not to prompt the listener's perception of the chimpanzee utterances as speech-like. Human perception is sensitive enough to perceive even non-speech sounds as phonomic, but to mask their otherwise inhuman quality. So they're basically just playing this for a bunch of people and almost getting their perspective on it. And they've got like this massive section on how they coded the different sounds. I'm not an expert on this type of subject, but they're specifically trying to quantify the results, quantify how people were perceiving these chimps. There's a lot in the results section that kind of breaks down step by step how they code certain things and how they interpret certain things and how listeners were like guided to transcribe, like what their methodology really was. But I'm trying to be a little bit more brief in the coverage of some of my papers, so this is open access. You can go check it out if you'd like. They say, in summary, we took several precautions to avoid inflating agreement in our listener data. Regardless of the coding scheme applied, data consistently provides support for our interpretation. For all chimpanzee would-be consonants, M was the most consistently transcribed interpretation. Transcription for vowels was more variable, possibly reflecting the diverse linguistic background of our sample. And they go over some of the examples there of like what people might have interpreted the vowels as. Finally, the data analyzed in this study were found data. We did not have any input on the circumstances of their recordings or of the animal's behavior. Thus, recording quality may have served as a depressor of agreement between listeners. Given control over recording conditions and direct contact with the animals, our listener data would likely show greater agreement. Basically, their point there was that despite the fact that these were kind of grody audio files, there was still a massive amount of agreement, and most people indeed did hear both Renata and Johnny say mama a bunch of times. In their discussion titled Expediting the Gift of Gab, they say our results add to the emerging discussion on the evolution of the vocal brain. In particular, findings reported here suggest that aspects of the neurological audio-vocal system, the study of which has often assumed convergent evolution in human and songbird lineages, may have much older origins than previously thought. Our results falsify two facets downstream of the Kuipers-Jurgens hypothesis, the theory positing that a lack of control of the vocal apparatus precludes vocal learning. First and most evidently, our data are evidence of learned novel vocalizations by chimpanzees. That is not to claim that there have been no neurological changes in the human brain that facilitate speech production. However, one meaningful example is the progressive increase in the size and complexity from chimpanzees to humans of the temporofrontal connectivity, e.g., the arcuate fasciculus, associated with a capacity for vocal imitation. However, our findings caution that whatever changes may be observed in ape to human neurology does not allow, for unreservedly inferring an evolutionary timeline towards speech without dedicated research effort and direct evidence from great ape vocal behavior. So their point here is that, however small, this is something that chimpanzees can actually do that we previously thought they couldn't do. That is to say, articulate basic words, simple words that are well known across many, many, many human languages. We thought they couldn't do it. It turns out they can, and the authors are saying this is why we need to look to great ape vocal behavior, specifically in the modern day, before we infer and sort of impose on the fossil record where and when certain abilities with regard to human language in the hominin lineage actually emerged. And I think that's good practice. They go on to say, second, Brown and colleagues speculate that overlap between somatotopic cortical representations of larynx and jaw represented, quote, the critical evolutionary step to develop syllable structure from a precursor of mandibular oscillations, creating an evolutionary transition from primate lip smacking to something like the ba-ba-ba sound of human babbling by means of voice and jaw coupling. So they're basically saying, we have shown that this step that we thought occurred in the human lineage, going from lip smacking to the ba-ba-ba that's constrained by the jaw and the larynx working together, that missing link just does exist in other apes, which means it's not a missing link that occurred in hominins. It's a precursor to both lineages, or maybe even further back than that, including orangutans and gorillas. They say our data definitely demonstrate that chimpanzees have passed this, quote, critical evolutionary step, while undoubtedly a crucial underpinning of speech production. The hypothesized missing link precluding chimpanzees from voluntary jaw-voice coupling evidently does not exist. They say our recovered chimpanzee recordings involved two unrelated individuals of different sexes living in different time periods on different continents, but producing the same lexical form. mama. These two cases clearly align with ape language projects that repeatedly reported mama as one of the words vocally learned by ape subjects, but dismissed in the absence of rigorous analysis. The phoneme M is ubiquitous in human languages and is among the first speech sounds to be produced in human ontogeny, sometimes as early as 2 months of age. This early in life occurrence results in part from infant vocal anatomy limiting possible articulations, making cycles among the first available multisyllabic utterances in an infant's repertoire. That's a really notable observation, I think, because a human infant's laryngeal setup actually looks more like a chimpanzee than an adult human's, because it turns out there's a lot of dissension that has to happen as humans grow, and that's why we learn to talk, because our vocal setup finally becomes set in stone and opens up all these additional sounds for us to make. So that's, kind of important here. They say, accordingly, it has been argued that mama may have been among the first words to appear in human speech. Our data complements this picture. Chimpanzees can produce the putative first words of spoken language. Chimpanzees outperform other mammals by sounding more human. The lexical form mama when spoken by chimpanzees exhibits the phonetic features typical of the same utterance when produced by human speakers and are perceived as contextually appropriate syllables by human listeners. That's true. If you closed your eyes and listened to those videos again, I think it would be fair enough to be like, okay, a human is probably saying this. You wouldn't think that it was coming from a parrot or something of that nature. These results corroborate a growing body of evidence that great apes are vocal production learners, dispelling decades-old misconceptions about the species' voice and articulatory control, and by extension, their value as comparative models for speech and language evolution. Because ours are secondary data sourced from historical footage and not collected in circumstances of experimental control, we may not ascertain how these two chimpanzee subjects acquired their novel speech-like vocalizations. We may, however, draw important comparisons. We'll end here with their conclusion, which I think is great. Revisiting ape language. Great ape language projects have been misrepresented in the literature. The few ape subjects involved have been mistakenly depicted as trustworthy representations of the capabilities and capacities of their entire genus. Our findings show that the interpretation of these classic studies may be done with caution, namely, absence of evidence should not be taken as evidence of absence. 50 years after these projects, caretakers who looked after the welfare of the great apes during these projects are documenting and re-examining the neglect and cruelty inflicted on these animals on the quest of psychological study. Subjects in ape language studies were traumatized, their emotional, ecological, and social needs unmet, with many being captured in the wild after the murder of their mother, subjected to unhealthy and unnatural environments, and starved of modeling of healthy group behaviors. Current discussions on the evolution of speech and language have nevertheless continued to base their assumptions on these studies, while disregarding a new generation of ethically approved studies conducted in accredited animal welfare institutions and in the wild. Great apes can produce human words, and failure to demonstrate this half a century ago was the fault of the researchers, not the animals. I think this is just so cool, right? Because we've come basically full circle all the way back to the reports of the very first ape language studies saying, yeah, chimps might be able to say simple words like mama and papa and up and cup. And then we had decades and decades and decades of people being like, no, they can't. And now we're back to, well, they might be able to. Yeah, maybe. Simple words, at least. And again, despite the fact that these words are extremely simple, like 1 to 2 year old level, maybe even a little bit more babyish than that, it's a really, really important observation to make, because it tells us that the ability to form the very first words in our lineage's history, right? These mama-related words that seem to consistently across all human languages mean mother, a pretty important figure in a baby's life, that ability precedes the human and chimpanzee split roughly 7 million years ago, that it's very ancient indeed. And I wonder what that means for our interpretation of the language abilities of hominins like Australopiths. Because again, this isn't just making a sound that kind of sounds like mama. The researchers actually quantified what's going on morphologically and physiologically in these chimpanzees' mouths. They're making this sound in the same way that a human infant does. That suggests that it's basal to both lineages. I'm not thinking that we're going to have any chimpanzees reciting Shakespeare anytime soon, and I certainly hope that those types of studies stay dead and buried, but it is pretty cool to know that chimpanzees, when taught or when properly encultured, can say a couple of words. They can talk. Anyways, my gentle and of course very modern apes, I hope you enjoyed this. This was a really fun one to make. I always love getting in the weeds with language and the evolution of it, and this is another fun step towards understanding more of it. If you like this kind of content, if you like what I do, please consider supporting me in the way that is free to you. Liking, commenting, subscribing, things like that. And if you want to support me in a more financial way, you can join my Patreon. Patrons sometimes get early access to videos, and they always get their names at the end of every video. And so, my gentle and of course very modern apes, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you for being a curious primate, and I'll see you real soon in the next one.